This program was made...
Which of these stories will you be talking about tomorrow? Mr. Bush's war on the Constitution, troubling himself even to meet the media to insist he'll veto the latest tightening of the FISA noose around our necks if the Democrats dare to include merely judicial review of the warrantless eavesdropping.
Protect America Act is a vital tool in stopping the terrorists, and it would be a grave mistake for Congress to weaken this tool.
Speaking of tools, the vice president depicted at the apex of a 30-year quest to build the tools of an imperial presidency in which the Congress, the Constitution, and you don't count. John Dean begins his TV adaptation of his book Broken Government with The Man Who Decided to Break the Government. And next, more on Giuliani's 23 interrupted terror plots and the Iran derby. McCain says something's up. Thompson actually says he'd talk to Congress. And Romney gives an answer that pleases nobody.
You sit down with your attorneys and tell you what you have to do. But
okay, so we got another guy running for king, not president. And if you think you're not impressed with them, Bush confidant Dan Bartlett bashes Romney, bashes McCain, bashes Huckabee, and especially bashes...
biggest dud, Fred Thompson.
Would you actually pick just one biggest dud as the lunatic right-wing fringe attacks a 12-year-old boy, claiming he was an undeserving recipient of federal health care, that his family must be lying about their middle-class income, sending Michelle Malkin to stake out their home, and posting the family's address on the internet? All of it reportedly spread by someone in the office of Senate Minority Leader McConnell. These people on the extreme right, are they still people? Plus, Lindsay Lohan tells all to OK Magazine. Danny Bonaducci gets first a big charge from this. Now he's getting a big lawsuit from this. And our number stumper, 80 proof times DUI number 2 equals 48 days for the guy from 24. All that and more now on Countdown. Good evening from New York. It was 5 years ago tonight, one of the low points of our democracy, like the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution vote in 1964, or the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, or the declaration of war against Spain in Cuba in 1898. October 10th, 2002, Congress voting to give President Bush the authority to use military force against Iraq. On this October 10th, that same president is trying to claim authority that would allow him to spy on Americans without fear of retribution or oversight. Our fifth story on the Countdown, Mr. Bush angrily threatened today that he will not sign the new eavesdropping bill for which he drools if it does not also grant retroactive immunity to the telecommunications companies conducting his surveillance for him. So what exactly would those companies need protection from? The petulance of the president's words more evident than usual this morning on the South Lawn of the White House, all because Congress has not given him everything he asked for in legislation that would extend the government's ability to monitor the phone calls or emails of suspected terrorists, even when they involve an American citizen. Mr. Bush apparently angry because lawmakers are requiring some judicial oversight as well as some legal recourse for those who might find themselves abused by this program.
My administration will work with members of Congress from both sides of the aisle to reach an agreement on a bill that will allow us to protect our country. The final bill must meet certain criteria. It must give our intelligence professionals the tools and flexibility they need to protect our country. It must keep the intelligence gap firmly closed and ensure that protections intended for the American people are not extended to terrorists overseas who are plotting to harm us. And it must grant liability protection to companies who are facing multi-billion-dollar lawsuits only because they are believed to have assisted in the efforts to defend our nation following the 9/11 attacks.
If the companies are only believed to have assisted, why would they need any immunity? As for the restrictions that would be imposed upon the Bush administration by the proposed legislation in amended form, they would not be all that restrictive. For example, in order to monitor phone calls or emails when U.S. citizens are involved, the administration would only be required to obtain so-called blanket warrants from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. However, the warrant would be good for a year, and the administration would be allowed to wait 45 days before seeking the warrant. The current grace period is just 72 hours. The measure would also place limits on collecting certain kinds of overseas communications by making a distinction between, for example, counter-terror collection and intelligence that is strictly, quote, in the furtherance of the foreign affairs of the U.S. In other words, they would need to have an actual definable reason. John Conyers, whose Judiciary Committee passed the amended bill out of its committee today without the immunity provision, saying, quote, the legislation before us today seeks to once again strike the appropriate balance between needed government authority and our precious rights and liberties. Time now to turn to our own Howard Fineman, senior Washington correspondent for Newsweek magazine. Howard, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
This phrase from the president this morning, my administration will work with members of Congress from both sides of the aisle to reach an agreement. There's a variation of this again and again in all of his recent remarks about FISA, S-chip health care legislation for children. And here again, does he mean work together to reach an agreement that pleases some people in some way, or does he mean you haven't given me everything I've asked for yet?
I think it's more the latter, Keith. I've talked to Democrats today who are describing to me these monthly bipartisan, bicameral meetings down at the White House with the president. And the way they go is that everybody troops into the cabinet room. The president says what he wants to say, and then all the members of Congress get to talk. And according to the members of Congress, his attention kind of wanders. I mean, he's not making paper airplanes, but he's not really paying close attention. And I think that's symbolic of the situation here. He doesn't really want to deal with them. He doesn't talk to them. He hasn't picked up the phone and called Harry Reid or Nancy Pelosi in a long time, as far as I know, which would be the most direct route. He wants the confrontations and he wants the victories because that's the way he shores up what's left of his political support in his own base.
But what is this this demand for immunity for companies that are, even in his own words, only believed to have participated in these activities that the administration claims are perfectly legal to begin with? This seems like a man saying, look over here, this is my Achilles heel. What is this about?
Well, in talking to Democrats about that, I said if all of this was kosher and legal, as the president argues it was, what do these companies need protection for? What do they need immunity from? They really can't answer that question because the administration won't give them the documents that the congressmen want to be able to investigate this. And that's the situation that the Democrats find themselves in. And they're afraid to veto, they're afraid to have a confrontation with the president on this because they're afraid that once again he will mow them on the terrorism issue.
But is there a point at which is there a tipping point relative to that exact point where it no longer matters and the number of vetoes outweighs the spinelessness of Democrats on this point?
I don't know. I don't know, Keith. The Democrats still seem, in Congress, still seem spooked by the notion that they can confront the president on something like this. They put all kinds of protection, at least in the House version, for what the president wants. I mean, you talked about the blanket warrants and so forth, but they're still afraid to confront him over what seemingly would be a winning issue of letting the phone companies off the hook, but they seem to be afraid to do it, and I don't know when all of that will accumulate either to their benefit or to the president's harm. At this point, the president's numbers are so low with the general public, he doesn't really seem to care.
And to that point, let's assume that they grow a backbone and the president vetoes the legislation. The administration does not get the right to eavesdrop on Americans without warrants anymore, and they don't get the immunity on the telecommunications companies. Who would that really hurt other than the president? How do the Democrats come to believe they lose in that scenario?
Well, for one reason, there is a legitimate concern about calls routed through the United States that we need to monitor and that do catch Americans in the net, so to speak. But the Democrats are addressing that concern, but they're afraid that they lose any argument in the general public on this topic. But if they don't make it the attempt, then they're going to lose both ways.
Howard Fineman of MSNBC and Newsweek, as always, great thanks, and particularly for that explanation right there. Thanks, Howard.
Thank you, Keith.
Mr. Bush's fight to secure permanently the right of the American government to eavesdrop upon its citizens without warrants, all part and parcel of a power grab that has defined this presidency, or rather this co-presidency with Dick Cheney, as it was once described by one biographer, and who, it seems, as described by another biographer, has been envisioning an imperial presidency for quite some time. Boston Globe reporter Charlie Savage, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for reporting on the president's misuse of signing statements, writes in his new book, Takeover, The Return of the Imperial Presidency and the Subversion of American Democracy, that when it was revealed in 2005 that the administration had been spying on Americans without warrants, Mr. Cheney responded, "If you want to understand why this program is legal, go back and read my Iran-Contra report." The Iran-Contra minority opinion that Cheney had written back in 1987, with David Addington, no less, in which he argued it was, quote, unconstitutional for Congress to pass laws intruding on the commander-in-chief. Nixon White House counsel John Dean writing extensively about Mr. Cheney's views on the Iran-Contra affair and everything else that has shaped the vice president's pursuit of unparalleled executive power in his new book, Broken Government, How Republican Rule Destroyed the Legislative, Executive, and Judicial Branches. John joins us now in the first of a series of television adaptations of the themes of his book, which we are also calling, conveniently enough, Broken Government. John, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
So members of the Reagan administration arranged the sales of arms to Iran. The proceeds went to fund Nicaraguan guerrillas, breaking a law that was signed into law by Ronald Reagan. And Dick Cheney argues this was all actually legal. How?
He and his Republican colleagues showed a remarkable facility very early, decades ago, to really ignore facts and then to reinterpret the law. He claimed that the president could have vetoed this law. He had the inherent power. He was the sole voice in particularly in foreign affairs, and therefore the Congress had no business other than sending checks down to the White House to carry out its actions intruding in this. So that was his theory, and was the approach they took in this rather remarkable and dubious document.
Any student in Dick Cheney 101 knows that the roots of his desire to be kingmaker, if not king, were planted during how he perceived Watergate. But how did he come away from that era believing that the country damaged the presidency and not the other way around?
Well, I think Cheney 101 also shows very clearly how a man, the higher he rises in office, doesn't change, but he reveals himself even further. And when he, for example, took the position after Watergate that had somehow weakened the presidency, he claimed that Nixon just didn't stay and fight long enough. He just ignores, again, the fact that the evidence was overwhelming. The man was looking for an impeachment conviction. It was not just Democrats, it was Republicans. But he thought they should have waged the battle, and they gave in too soon, maybe defy the courts or come get us because we're the commander-in-chief, we've got the troops. He never has explained this, but it is a fallacious argument.
And isn't the essence that's sometimes overlooked in giving credence to parts of this argument and saying, well, there needed to be a different shift of balance of power between the executive and the legislative, isn't it sort of overlooked here that the idea of an imperial presidency essentially contradicts almost 100% with the idea of representative democracy?
It does, and it's certainly exactly what the founders of our country rejected from the outset. They did not want to have an elected monarch. They wanted to have, indeed, the legislative branch was deemed to be the most powerful and have, particularly in foreign affairs, a very large role that has slowly been eroded by strong presidents or presidents, pushing the envelope. And this has been Cheney's theme all along. When post-Watergate, the Congress sort of balanced the playing field, if you will, Cheney thought that weakened the presidency. When he came into office in 2001, I want to assure you that the evidence shows that he inherited a presidency far stronger than anything Nixon had at the height of his power, and indeed because Reagan had done a lot of work in the intervening years to strengthen it.
Speaking of 2001, I don't want to get into the nefariously coincidental, but how was Dick Cheney in particular so well positioned to take advantage